I want you to try and picture it. The 13th of December, 1981. You're standing in the village of Shropshire in Shropshire. You look at the thermometer on your wall, and you can scarcely believe your eyes. It reads -25 degrees Celsius, the coldest December temperature ever recorded in the history of England. But this wasn't just a single brutal night of frost. No, this was merely the opening act of a 7-week ordeal, a winter that would test the very fabric of Britain, in a way we hadn't seen since the Great Freeze of '63. From the dark days of early December, right through to the middle of January, our nation fought a desperate battle. We fought against ice that didn't just frost the windows, but cracked the glass clean through. We fought against snow that didn't just coat the ground, but buried entire villages until they vanished from the map. It was a cold that didn't just chill your skin, it crept deep into your marrow and stayed there. Yet, for those of us who lived through the big snow of '82, the memory isn't just about the shivering. It's about the sight of neighbours appearing through the mist with shovels in hand, strangers sharing their last bags of coal, and that quiet, profound discovery of what truly matters when the world outside simply freezes over. It all began so quietly, didn't it? The start of December was actually quite mild. In Aberdeen, the mercury hit 15 degrees on the 3rd. People were strolling about in light coats, and we all thought, just for a moment, that winter might skip us entirely this year. We were wrong. Terribly wrong. On the 7th of December, everything changed in an instant. The wind veered sharply to the north, and a wave of biting Arctic air swept down from Scandinavia, colliding with the British Isles. By the morning of the 8th, much of southern England had vanished under a thick blanket of white. Wiltshire and Berkshire were buried under 15 centimetres of snow in mere hours. The roads, which had been clear the day before, turned into treacherous ice rinks overnight. Airports ground to a halt, trains stopped in their tracks, and telephone lines snapped under the weight of the ice. To make matters worse, almost no one had been properly warned. Thousands of workers set off that morning, only to find themselves stranded in a frozen wasteland. Cars were abandoned in ditches like scrap metal, and buses gave up halfway up hills, their wheels spinning uselessly. What should have been a simple commute became a 7-hour nightmare, but the cold was only getting started. By the 11th of December, another fierce blizzard struck, and this time London took the full brunt of it. 30 centimetres of snow piled up in the suburbs, and even Parliament struggled to function. The Queen herself was reportedly stranded for hours in a Cotswold pub, a reminder that nature, in its frozen fury, spares no one. Then came the night of the 13th, the night Britain truly froze solid. Temperatures plummeted below -18 across vast swathes of the country. Shropshire recorded its historic -25, and Wales hit a staggering -22 at Corwin. Records that had stood for over a century were shattered in a single night, but the tragedy wasn't just on land. Out in the English Channel, gale-force winds turned the sea into a blinding storm. 2 ships sank that week, and on the 19th of December, a dark day in our history, the Penley lifeboat capsized while attempting to rescue a damaged cargo ship off the Cornish coast. 16 brave souls were lost to the sea. Britain mourned, but the cold didn't care. It simply kept coming. The cold didn't just arrive, it took complete command of our lives. Your breath would freeze in mid-air, hanging like a ghostly mist in the hallway. Ice began to form on the inside of the windows, and I'm not talking about the delicate frost patterns you could easily scrape away with a fingernail. No, this was thick, jagged ice, the kind you'd need a kitchen knife to remove. Waking up in the morning meant preparing yourself, physically and mentally, for the shock. The bedroom felt like a walk-in freezer, and the bathroom, well, that was even worse. Getting dressed was a race against time. You had to move fast before the cold truly settled into your skin. You see, back in '82, central heating was still a luxury that most families simply didn't have. You relied entirely on a single coal fire downstairs. One room with heat, while the rest of the house became a literal Arctic wasteland. Families would huddle together in the living room, wearing every jumper they owned, blankets wrapped tightly around their shoulders, hands reaching out toward flames that barely warmed you unless you were sat right beside them. At night, going to bed felt like an expedition. You'd dive under a mountain of heavy blankets, sometimes 4 or 5 layers deep, just to trap enough body heat to survive. Your clothes for the following morning were laid out at the foot of the bed, because leaving them in a drawer meant putting on fabric that was frozen stiff by sunrise. Some people even slept in their heavy overcoats. Not because they were poor, but because it was the only way to avoid the creeping threat of hypothermia during the night. The snow, meanwhile, just kept falling, layer upon layer, week after week. By Christmas Day, the landscape was unrecognizable. In Lincoln, the snow lay over 30 centimetres deep, and even in North London, 10 inches of white powder had brought everything to a standstill. But the real enemy wasn't just the depth of the snow, it was the relentless, unyielding cold. Temperatures remained trapped below freezing for weeks on end. The snow didn't melt. It simply sat there, piling up layer upon layer, week after week, until the country began to feel like a forgotten world. Rivers that had flowed for centuries froze solid. Harbours became locked in ice, and along parts of the southern coast, something truly surreal happened. The sea itself began to freeze. When the tide retreated, it left behind massive blocks of ice scattered across the beaches, leaving fishing boats trapped in a frozen grip. Inland, roads simply vanished under drifts that reached 6 meters high in places. Entire villages were cut off from civilization. No deliveries, no post, no way in, and no way out. Your mother likely started stockpiling long before the worst hit. Tinned food, extra loaves of bread, and bottles of milk lined up in the hallway, because the fridge simply couldn't hold the emergency supplies. Running out of food wasn't just an inconvenience, it wasn't an option. Shops were closing their shutters, and roads were blocked by walls of white. If you forgot a basic necessity, you did without, or you gathered your courage, knocked on a neighbour's door, and prayed they had a spare to share. Getting to the bakeries became an expedition of its own. Queues would form in the biting dawn, people waiting for over an hour just for a single loaf of bread. Butter was rationed, sugar disappeared, and for those in the cut-off villages, tinned condensed milk in tea became the new normal. It was the sharp, lingering taste of making do. Power cuts became a part of daily life. Over 250,000 homes were plunged into darkness during that December, as snow and ice weighed down overhead lines until they snapped like dry twigs. When the power went, everything stopped. No heating, no light, just the flicker of candles and the glow of the coal fire. Families would sit in the dark for hours, playing cards, telling stories, trying to stay warm until the electricity finally flickered back to life. But for the children? Well, it felt as if Christmas had arrived weeks early. Schools were closed, not just for a day, but for weeks at a time. To a child, this wasn't a crisis, it was freedom. No lessons, just endless fields of white, and the chance to build snow fortresses that would stand until the new year. Sledges appeared from every shed and garage. Tea trays were borrowed from kitchens. Baking sheets taken without asking. Anything that could slide was fair game, and every street had its own sledging hill, protected like sacred territory. Kids would spend entire days racing down, trudging back up, soaking wet, but grinning from ear to ear. Your gloves would grow stiff with ice. Your socks would be sodden, but nobody cared. This was the winter of a lifetime. Yet, behind the fun, life was desperately hard. The elderly struggled to survive in their freezing homes, and hypothermia cases began to flood our hospitals. Doctors and nurses became true heroes, trudging through waist-deep snow to make house calls, their medical bags frozen solid as they tried to reach patients who were entirely cut off. Helicopters buzzed overhead like giant insects, dropping essentials to isolated farms, bread, medicine, the bare necessities of life. Farmers watched helplessly as their livestock froze in the fields, sheep buried alive under the drifts. By the time January arrived, thousands of animals had been lost. The cost was devastating, but the farmers didn't complain. They simply got on with it, because back then, that was just what you did. As December drew to a close, a flicker of hope spread across the country. A brief, mild spell on New Year's Day brought rain instead of snow, and for a fleeting moment, we thought the worst was behind us. But it was a cruel trick of nature. The cold returned on the 3rd of January, heavier, meaner, and this time, it brought something far more terrifying. January the 7th, 1982. As evening fell over Wales, the sky didn't just darken, it opened up. This wasn't a light dusting of snow. It was a relentless, punishing blizzard that refused to stop for 36 hours. Driven by gale-force easterly winds, the snow was dry and powdery, allowing the wind to whip it into massive, lethal drifts. By the morning of the 9th, South Wales lay buried. Glamorgan and Monmouthshire were vanished under 60 centimetres of level snow. But it was the drifts that were the real horror. In exposed areas, the wind had piled the snow 6 metres high, 20 feet of solid white walls. Cars didn't just get stuck, they disappeared completely. Houses were transformed into accidental igloos, with gates and hedges vanishing beneath the shifting landscape. South Wales was severed from the rest of the world for 3 long days. The army was called in, troops arriving with shovels to clear roads 1 agonising metre at a time. They were the lifeline, delivering bread and milk to villages that hadn't seen a delivery van in a fortnight. Helicopters buzzed constantly overhead, lifting out the sick and dropping crates of food. In Swansea, the local radio station, Swansea Sound, became the heartbeat of the community. They coordinated rescues, broadcasting desperate appeals for anyone with a 4-wheel drive to help a woman in labour, or to deliver a loaf of bread to an elderly neighbour. Strangers with Land Rovers became the heroes of the hour, and farmers opened their doors to stranded motorists, proving that while the weather was at its worst, the people were at their very best. While the towns were cut off, life inside the home became a lesson in basic survival. Your mother would boil water on the stove just for a simple wash, a kettle and a ceramic bowl. No luxury of a hot bath or a long shower. Just a flannel and lukewarm water that turned cold before you'd even finished. Your father would be constantly checking the coal supply, calculating with a heavy heart how long those precious black stones would last. Burning anything else that would catch a flame. Old newspapers, broken chairs, anything to keep that flicker of life alive in the hearth. Then came the 10th of January, the coldest morning Britain had ever recorded in its long history. Braemar, high in the Scottish Highlands, hit minus 27.2 degrees Celsius. It equalled the all-time UK record set nearly a century before, but England was barely a breath behind. Newport, in Shropshire, recorded a staggering minus 26.1. It was the coldest temperature ever recorded in England, in over 300 years of meticulous record-keeping. That afternoon, the sun offered no warmth at all. In Braemar, the maximum temperature only reached minus 19. Think about that for a moment. The warmest part of the entire day was nearly 20 degrees below freezing. People who dared to step outside described the air as sharp, like breathing in shards of broken glass. Your lungs would ache with every breath. Your face felt as if it were burning, and any exposed skin turned numb in mere seconds. Even as far south as Wiltshire, the daytime mercury stayed well below minus 10. Then, on the 13th of January, a thick, ghostly fog smothered the country. Visibility dropped to nothing. Roads became literal death traps, cars skidding helplessly and lorries crashing into the white abyss. And yet, somehow, Britain carried on. The postman still made his rounds, and the milkman still delivered. Because back then, that was simply the British way. But here is what the history books often fail to mention about the big snow of '82. It wasn't just a story of survival against the elements. It was a story about the unbreakable strength of community. When the snow buried your street and threatened to swallow your home, people didn't retreat. They came out. Strangers who had never shared a word spent hours digging out each other's cars. The elderly weren't forgotten. They were checked on daily by neighbours who brought hot soup and a few precious lumps of coal. Families shared what little they had left. In church halls and smoky community centres, people gathered, not just to seek the warmth of a heater, but to find the warmth of company. You'd sit with folks you'd never met, drinking tea, playing dominoes, and sharing stories that made the cold feel just a little further away. The ice changed everything. When everyone is freezing, asking for help isn't embarrassing, it's necessary. And giving that help? Well, that felt as natural as breathing. The BBC reported the chaos with that classic calm resolve. Severe weather continues. Motorists are advised to take care. No panic, no drama, just a quiet, stubborn acknowledgement that, yes, it is dreadful, but we will manage. We always do. By the middle of January, the frost finally loosened its iron grip. Warmer air crept in from the west, and the world began to weep as the snow turned to slush. The roads reappeared, the railways cleared, and Britain, tired, frostbitten, and covered in the soot of a million fires, began to breathe again. When the milk arrived, truly liquid for the first time in weeks, people actually stood on their doorsteps and cheered. Life slowly returned to normal, but we were changed. We had less back then, fewer gadgets, no central heating. But somehow, it felt like we had more. We had each other. Were you there during those frozen months of 1982? Do you remember the absolute silence of the deep snow, or the way your street pulled together to survive? Please share your story in the comments below. Let's keep these memories alive for the next generation. And if this brought back a shiver or a smile, do subscribe to the channel. Until next time, stay warm.